Have you ever wondered how gardeners of old decided when to plant? I mean, they didn't have access to the internet, ChatGPT, or cooperative extension guides to give them their average last frost date, and they didn't have a weather app to tell them if a cold front was coming through soon. This has always fascinated me, to realize that gardeners have been growing food for thousands of years without the help of all of these things that are so second nature to us. So, how in the world did they do it? We may think we're smart and advanced, but if we were to sit down with gardeners of old, we'd realize how much knowledge and wisdom we lack, especially when it comes to reading nature's cues. But we do have technology now. We do have science and research. Should we just throw all that away? I don't think so. I think we are now in the best position to blend the two worlds so that we can make the most informed decisions, especially dealing with a climate that seems to be changing by the year. Today, we're going to explore what we do know about what gardeners traditionally used to know when to plant. We'll talk about whether this has any backing in what we now know scientifically, or if it's simply tradition and folklore. This is the kind of episode that I hope you sit back and enjoy. Trust me, it's a fun one. Before we get started, this episode is brought to you in part by Garden in Minutes. Friends, gardening does not have to be complicated. Garden in Minutes simplifies everything with their all-in-one bundles and amazing garden grid watering system. Durable, tool-free, and easy, mine have lasted for years, even through harsh winters. Plus, their raised beds now come in taller, waist-high options. Visit journeywithjill.net/gardeninminutes and use code JILL to save 7%. Simplify your garden and watch it thrive. Also, I wanted to let you know that we have decided to open up our online garden planning course, Dream to Garden, one last time in the spring. So if you're interested in jumping in and getting help with planning your garden, even if you haven't started yet, check it out now. I'll help you understand what to plant now, what it might be too late to plant, and what you can plant in the fall instead, and how to get going for the best garden season you have ever had. Just visit journeywithjill.net/dream-to-garden or check out the link in the show notes. As I am recording this, which is a couple of weeks before you are hearing it, I am about 1 week away from my average last frost date. I have my tomatoes ready to go in my greenhouse. They are ready whenever the garden is. And we actually haven't had a freeze in several weeks. It would be easy for me to decide, okay, it's time to plant because so much of spring has actually sprung, but I'm going to wait. One reason is because I looked at my 10-day forecast and it's showing a low of 37 to 38 in about a week, which is right around our actual average last frost date. And I know from experience that often can go much lower once we get closer to that time. Plus, tomatoes in particular don't love temperatures in the 40s at night, so I know all of those things. But the main reason I'm not planting is because I checked my weather app and I'm seeing what's happening in the next 10 days. But as I mentioned earlier, what did gardeners do when they didn't have the weather at their fingertips? How did they decide when it was actually safe to plant? What they did is they used nature's cues. They looked to see what was blooming and what was coming out at what time, and that's how they determined when to plant. Well, that's one of the ways. Many of them also garden by the moon, which we have done a podcast episode about that in the past. We can link that in the show notes. But they also used nature's cues, which is called phenology. Phenology is a fancy word, but what it means is it's the study of seasonal changes in plants and animals, especially in relation to climate and weather. Phenology combines tradition and observation with some scientific backing, which we'll talk about today. Gardeners used phenology, even if they didn't know what the word meant, to determine the planting times because plants and animals respond directly to changes in temperature, daylight, and even soil conditions. So as I talk to you a little bit about some of the ways that we can read nature, such as some things that are blooming, and once something's blooming, then you can plant this. You may ask, is phenology actually science or is it simply tradition? And just because it's tradition doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it does mean that we should have a healthy dose of skepticism to see if science backs it up. But the truth is that phenology is grounded in science and it has deep traditional roots. It's both and it's really interesting. In fact, modern scientific research validates many of these phenological signs, but others are purely anecdotal or cultural. Some phenological indicators have proven remarkably reliable, backed by research on soil and air temperature correlations. So as we talk about some of these examples, understand that we do have science to back some of this up, and it really does make common sense. Especially if you've been gardening for a while, I think a lot of this is going to start clicking for you. So what I want to do is I want to share with you some examples, some practical phenology examples, especially when it comes to spring planting. Now, if you're like me and you are not all that in tune with flowers and trees and what kind they are, I'm definitely learning as I go, then some of this you may need to Google or find out, okay, what is this tree or what is this shrub or what is this bloom? But once you learn it, it'll be fascinating to see how you can apply this in your garden. So number one, let's talk about Forsythia blooms. These are some of the first plants to bloom in the spring, and this is typically the time when you can plant peas, lettuce, and leafy greens when those blooms appear. Reason for this is that these blooms start appearing when air temperatures are around 55 degrees. Warming has begun in the spring, but it's not stable enough for warm season crops. That's why when Forsythia blooms, you can plant these cooler season crops, but not the warmer season crops. If you have Forsythia close by, watch them, and then you can wait for the blooms to fade before thinking that it's safe to plant crops like tomatoes or even peppers. Now, if you don't have Forsythia nearby or you're not sure what it is, some other examples that bloom about the same time are going to be Bradford pear, flowering quince, star magnolia, and redbud trees. The second example are dandelion blooms. When I walk out into my garden right now, the dandelions are popping at the very end of March and the beginning of April. And this, for many people, indicates a great time to plant potatoes. The reason is because dandelions bloom when air and surface soil temperatures start to consistently rise above 45 to 50 degrees. And those of you guys who have heard many of the potato podcasts here recognize that that 45-degree minimum is what you want to have in soil temperature before you plant potatoes. Otherwise, the potatoes may not sprout or they may rot in the ground. But if dandelion blooms are going to start coming out at about that same 45 to 50 degree soil temperature, then this would be a good indication that potatoes are going to be able to be planted and do well. So if you don't want to take a soil thermometer to your soil, which is something I do recommend, but you want to follow nature's cues instead, then these dandelion blooms would be a good indication that the soil has naturally warmed and it's safe to plant potatoes. The third sign would be dandelions in full bloom and you start to see lilac leaves emerge. When this happens, this would be a good time to plant beets, carrots, and lettuce, and also cole crops like broccoli and collards. The reason is because lilac leaf emergence and peak dandelion blooming correspond with soil temperatures consistently ranging from the upper 40s to low 50s, which is the ideal germination range for these cool season vegetables that you direct sow. Now that's going to apply for most of us in carrots, lettuce, beets, and spinach, but probably not your broccoli and your cabbage because most of us are transplanting those. So you may have already transplanted those, or this would be a good time to transplant them. But when we're talking about soil temperature, this is a really good time to plant these seeds because they're more likely to emerge because the soil temperature is warm enough. So this ensures rapid germination and early plant growth. Now, I do want to give a caveat just because I live in Arkansas and I know that right now dandelions are in full bloom, and I know I mentioned spinach. Yes, technically spinach would germinate right now and it possibly would work. But I also know from my past experience that spinach does tend to bolt when we get into the 80s, and that starts to happen in April. So Even though the soil temperature may be ideal for germination, you may not be able to get a full harvest if you live in an area where you go from cold to hot really quickly. So please understand that even as I'm sharing with you some of these phenological signs, do observe in your garden and do note where there might be exceptions where you may not want to rely entirely on that based on what you have observed in the past. The next sign is lily of the valley being in full bloom. When you see this, it is probably safe to plant tomatoes. Always use your judgment, cross-check on your frost dates and all of that. I hope all that is clear, but this is probably going to be a safe time for you to plant tomatoes. And the reason is because lily of the valley will bloom when soil temperatures have warmed to about 60 degrees. And this typically aligns closely with the ideal conditions for transplanting warm season crops like tomatoes. Also, at this temperature, tomatoes can establish quickly without the stress from cold soil conditions, which we talked about last week. Now, we talked about when lilac leaves emerge, but when the lilac is in full bloom, this can be a good time to transplant tomatoes and maybe even eggplants and peppers. The reason is because when the lilacs are in full bloom, soil temperatures are approximately 60 degrees or higher, which is optimal for warm season crops. Next, you may notice that bearded irises will be in full bloom, and this is also a great time to consider planting eggplants and peppers. Again, the daytime temperatures will have stabilized by now. The soil temperatures are probably about 60 degrees or above, and eggplants and peppers are specifically sensitive to cold stress. They require warm soils for optimal root growth and establishment. So if you wait for your irises, your bearding irises to bloom, most likely your soil is in a good condition to plant these warmer season crops. Next, if any of us have oak trees, check the size of their leaves. When the oak leaves are the size of a mouse's ear, this is a traditional indicator for planting corn. Oak leaves are sensitive to soil temperature, and this aligns closely with corn's preferred germination temperature, which is above 55 degrees. So as you can see here, so many of these signs correlate with not only air temperature, but also soil temperature, which is ideal for germination. Now, the next thing we're going to be talking about is something that I have heard about, but it's also something that I have observed in my garden every year and has been spot on every year, and that's called blackberry winter. So when we come back, I'll be talking to you about what blackberry winter means and how you can use it to know when to plant your warm season crops. I just wanted to take a moment to share with you one of the sponsors of today's episode, Organic Rev. With the last frost date finally in sight, this means it's almost time to get those warm season plants in the ground. But after spending weeks caring for my seedlings indoors, I want to make sure that they have the best start possible outside. And that's where Organic Rev makes all the difference. Every time I transplant, I mix Rev about 50-50 with water, just eyeballing it, and I dip the root ball before planting. This simple step helps reduce transplant shock, encourages stronger root growth, and gets my plants established faster. Rev works by supercharging the microbes in the soil, improving moisture retention, and unlocking nutrients. So my plants don't just survive the transition, they thrive. I've noticed that transplants treated with Rev settle in more quickly, grow stronger, and handle stress better, whether it's an unexpected cold snap or a sudden heat wave. I use it on everything: tomatoes, peppers, flowers, even fruit trees, and I can always tell which plants got the Rev treatment. If you're gearing up for transplanting after your last frost date, don't skip this step. Head to organicrev.com and use my code JILL10 to save 10% off of your order. Your garden will thank you. Let's talk about blackberry winter. I don't recall where I had first found out about this term or what it actually meant, but it's been on my radar for many years, and I've observed my blackberry bushes just out of curiosity to see if there is anything to this. What blackberry winter means is that it's best to delay planting tender, frost-sensitive crops until after blackberry bushes bloom and the final late spring cold snap has passed. The thought is that once your blackberries bloom, there will be one last cold snap after that, and then once that one passes, you're in the clear. Now, again, This is something that I have observed in my garden, but it has been spot on. Now, that one last cold snap hasn't always been a frost or a freeze, but sometimes it has been. In fact, last year, I think it was, I ended up planting my frost tender crops right around when the blackberries were blooming. And then we did have a cold front come through, but it wasn't a frost. It was close. It was like 36 degrees. So I escaped barely. But what I've seen over the past several years is that this has actually been true. And just yesterday, I went outside and I saw my blackberries blooming. And of course, my 10-day forecast is saying that there's a cold front coming in next week. And I'm like, it's going to work again. Now, is it going to work every year? No, not necessarily. But it has been really interesting for me to observe. Now, one thing I haven't looked into, which I think this would be kind of interesting if any of you guys want to observe this, is I'm not sure if there's a difference between the bloom time of blackberries that you plant in your garden that might be specific cultivars, or if that we're talking about native blackberries. I know some of you guys have aggressive blackberries that are just natural, and I have that in my landscape too. But I'm curious if there would be a difference between the two, because I know some, like jonquils, for instance, my mom's favorite plant was the jonquil. The native ones would actually bloom before the ones that she planted in her garden, and she always told me that. So I'm not sure if we're talking about native blackberries or the ones that we plant, but I'm referring to the ones that I've planted in my garden. That's what I've been able to observe. Now, the question is, can you rely on this when I just tell you that it's worked in my garden? Is there any scientific backing behind this? Well, what I've been able to find is that modern science confirms that this isn't merely folklore. There are some studies that indicate that spring weather patterns often include predictable late-season cold events. Phenological records, including those kept by agricultural extension offices and universities, support the reliability of this traditional indicator. Thus, delaying planting of these frost-tender crops like your tomatoes and your beans and your cucumbers after the blackberry winter can possibly help protect sensitive plants from unexpected frost damage. And again, as I said, in my experience, there is a cold snap after those bloom, but it's not always a frost. Sometimes it is. One time it was a freeze. So you just never know how bad of a cold snap it's going to be. Still, I think it's worth considering, especially if you have blackberries in your garden or natively growing nearby. Another indicator that people watch are dogwoods. When dogwood trees start blooming, this is when you want to plant heat-loving vegetables, tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, squash, melons, and beans. And this coincides again with consistent soil temperatures between 58 and 62 degrees, because dogwood blooms act as a natural indicator that soil temperature has warmed sufficiently and the risk of late frost has significantly diminished, which means that it may be safe to transplant or direct sow these sensitive vegetables. Other examples, if you don't have dogwood nearby, could be eastern redbud, crabapple, azaleas, and serviceberries. So those are some of the most common ones that I was able to research and find that science tends to back up to some degree. But there are some fun and peculiar traditional examples that I wanted to share with you, not necessarily because I want you to go by them, but more just because I think they're fun and entertaining. One of them is planting by frogs. Yeah, planting by frogs. The folklore is to plant peas when you hear the frogs croaking loudly at dusk. The reason is because traditionally it's believed that frogs emerge and call loudly when soil temperatures warm. I don't know. If you want to test that, let me know. We have a lot of toads around, but it seems like they're just always loud when it rains, so I'm not sure about soil temperatures. But if you've experienced that, I would love to hear. The next thing is the barefoot test. And I remember a guest on the podcast, probably one of the first couple of seasons. He was from White Harvest Seed Company. He actually mentioned this. But the barefoot test is that if you can comfortably walk barefoot in your garden, it's warm enough to plant cucumbers and melons. And he specifically said that if you can comfortably walk barefoot in your garden when, did he say the moon was full or at night, regardless? But I think he even said some people think that if you can sit down naked on your garden, then it's, I don't know. I mean, these anecdotes go crazy. But the whole thing is that if you're comfortable on the soil, whether it's your feet or other parts of your body, then it's probably warm enough to plant some of these warm season crops like cucumbers and melons. I thought that was interesting, and it makes sense, right? The other thing that I found, which I thought was really interesting because I remember these being everywhere when I was a kid, and those were the maple tree seed helicopters. Remember those little things we used to throw? And yeah, I don't have a maple tree anymore, but the old saying is that when the maple tree seeds, or it sends out helicopters, when they start twirling to the ground, you can plant your garden squash and your pumpkins. The reason is because the timing of maple seeds dropping often coincides with stable spring warmth and reduced frost risk. These were some both fun and logical examples, and I think you're seeing some themes here. And honestly, a lot of this I feel like is common sense to some degree. And if we look at nature, especially as how our springs have varied, like even blueberry blooms, like I mentioned in the blueberry episode, sometimes they bloom earlier, sometimes they bloom later, and a lot of it does depend on what is the cadence of this particular spring going to be. And because they're not always blooming at the precise same date, we know that there's something in nature that it's taking cues from. And if we look at that, then we can see that there probably is some truth to this. There is some wisdom in this. But I do want to go back and address this question. How reliable is phenology really? Well, I believe it can be a valuable natural indicator, but it's most reliable when we also pair it with modern gardening tools. As I mentioned before, we want to marry both of them. We want to marry the traditional knowledge and wisdom with the research that we have, with the tools that we have, local forecasts, soil thermometers. And yes, I'm still going to be planting by my planting calendar because I can't necessarily plan my garden ahead of time based on when something might bloom, but I can plan it based on the dates that I have, which is something I teach you how to do in Dream to Garden. But when it comes time to actually planting, even if my garden calendar said, okay, Jill, you can plant your tomatoes on April 8th, now that I know that we might actually get into the 30s on April 8th, I can delay it. That's following my weather forecast. But I can also look at my blackberry blossoms and wait for that last cold snap before I actually plant them. So I feel like it's really good to look at nature's cues, observe as much as we can, and then take that with the knowledge that we already have. Also, I want to encourage you, and this is something that I want to do as we observe, consider keeping personal phenology records to build your own gardening wisdom over the years, especially where you're located. Because as I mentioned before, when the Forsythia started blooming in my area, for example, I had already planted all those cool season crops because I know I have to get them in early before they start to bolt in our heat. So that's something that it would be good to keep records for your location so that you could adapt it accordingly. I think phenology in general is a good complementary tool, but it also adds confidence to what we're doing, and it also adds enjoyment into gardening when we're able to observe nature in what it's doing year after year. What I would like to invite you to do is I would love to hear your own phenology observations, examples, maybe something that's been passed down to you from a grandparent or a great-grandparent or a parent. I would love to hear what other examples can you provide that I wasn't able to find in my research. You can send me a DM on Instagram at The Beginner's Garden, or any of the email that I send out on Fridays. If you're getting my emails on Fridays, just reply to that and let me know what examples you can add. Also, I know for me personally, some emails that I have subscribed to have been getting caught in some other folders. So if you have subscribed but you haven't gotten an email from me in a while, check your promotions folder because sometimes it's going in there. But reply to some of those emails. Let me know. I'm just really curious what all people have been passed down or what all they have heard. I would love to hear all that. I think it's fun. And as we talked about, and just a reminder here that gardening is a blend of science, observation, and a touch of folklore and tradition that makes our garden journey even richer. I know I really enjoyed researching this and learning this, and the more that I can feel in tune with the nature around me, I feel like the better gardener I'm going to be altogether. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I would love to hear from you. So please reach out and let me know what examples you can offer. And I hope you have a fabulous week in the garden. We'll see you next week. This episode was brought to you in part by Garden in Minutes. Want easier gardening and healthier plants? Garden in Minutes all-in-one bundles and Garden Grid irrigation systems make it simple. Just visit journeywithjill.net/gardeninminutes and use code JILL for 7% off. If you get the Garden in Minutes irrigation system for your raised beds, you will not regret it. I 100% depend on that for gardening and irrigating in my raised beds. Again, journeywithjill.net/gardeninminutes and use promo code JILL.